Have you ever tried to pick a favorite era of your life? I tried. It's not as easy as it sounds. I'm 76, and a lot has happened in those years, both personally and generally speaking. Do I have a favorite era? Let's see. There's a lot to pick from. Choosing a particular era requires some thought about what it is that makes up an era, what it is that makes up a particular era. You could call the first era of my life my Detroit kid era. Growing up in Detroit, and I have to consider my family life and growing up with my brother and my folks and the good times and the bad times, I suppose. And for the most part, it was pretty carefree, but there are those moments that everybody has too. And you have to consider your school days, whether you were a nerd or one of the cool kids. That all counts in on how you look at the era and the music of the era. I really like that doo-wop style of music from that time. There's the angst of that era too. Your childhood friendships, the comings and goings thereof, and the realization that there's an opposite sex. And then there's high school, and things start to change in high school. You start seeing the bigger picture, beyond your neighborhood area. And speaking about music, rock and roll making some inroads. The Beatles, the Stones, the British invasion. And Vietnam starts taking on some new meaning as you start approaching draft age. I joined the Navy in 1968 in the midst of the Vietnam conflict. And after my tour in Southeast Asia, I got married and spent 2 years in Spain, where my son was born. My 4 years in the service would certainly qualify as an era. Call it my sailor era. And already it's starting to be more difficult to pick a favorite era. And the 70s themselves could easily be considered an era. In fact, they often are. It was our era. The post-war hippie days. Right on. Long hair, tie-dye, psychedelic music. Thinking Jefferson Airplane and Jimi Hendrix. It really was our time. The bell-bottom era. But I also had a divorce during that time, too, so it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. And it was also my time as a wedding photographer. So that was a pretty significant time of my life. And about that time, I started settling in and advancing in my regular job. I had money in my pocket and adventure in my heart. There was boats and fishing and another marriage and another divorce. It was my scuba diving days. That was a pretty fun time too. Well, then came an era of really dramatic change. The company that I was working for was changing hands, and it seemed like a good time to make a change and chase a dream of my own. It was a total change of lifestyle and the start of my homesteading adventure in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Off grid, solar power, wood heat. I remember snowing in that first winter and all that entailed, and how dark it got at night with no electricity. That's got to be a standalone era, right? Was it my favorite? We'll see. And after the homesteading era, I moved out of my home state. That was significant and the start of something new again. And that particular time it had more going on than any of the others. It was like three eras stacked on top of one another. It started, or I probably should say restarted, my motorcycle era. I joined a motorcycle club. You could call it my hog era. And that's where I met Kathy, and you could say it started my Kathy era, which I'm happily still in. And as my parents aged, it became my caregiver era until they passed away. And during that time, Kathy and I got married and bought a little seasonal place in Florida with our eyes on retirement, on Kathy's retirement. And after a couple of winters in Florida, we decided to become what they call around here halfbacks and decided to move our future plans to North Carolina. And then when Kathy retired, we became full-time Tar Heels. So I guess you could say that started our Smoky Mountain era. So you tell me, how does a person go about picking a favorite era? I suppose you have to ask yourself what sticks out the most, but to me, they all stick out in their own way. And like I've said many times before, I love it all, the good and the bad. If I could actually define a particular era, I wouldn't be able to discount it because something bad happened. And things that make up an era overlap. Music era, car eras, personal events eras. You could call a decade an era, but there's still some overlap involved. What starts in starts in one decade might end in another decade. So how do you sort that out? I guess you have to decide whether whether the beginning of the era was better than the ending of the era, or vice versa. Truth of the matter is, I'm happy as a clam right now. So this is my favorite era, whatever you want to call it. That doesn't mean I don't love the other eras, my childhood in Detroit, or my Navy time, or my homesteading time, any of that. I love it all in different ways. I just can't pick one over the others, so I'm picking now. If you're able to pick out a particular era as your favorite, I'd like to hear about it. Leave it down in the comments. I like reading that stuff. If you have a favorite era, what made it your favorite? What made it special to you? And thanks for coming by. I'm always happy you're here. Peace and joy, my friends, through all your eras.